For Victims and Villains, my name is Josh, and today we are talking about probably one of my most anticipated movies for this year, and that is The Exorcist, The Believer. Now, I'm gonna put a couple of disclaimers on this video before we start talking about the synopsis, before we start talking about how I feel. This is a movie that I am 100% unsure of how I feel. I feel like I need to see this movie at least one more time to make a accurate decision on whether or not I love it or whether or not I hate it. This movie is bound to be polarizing with audiences, fans of the original, and especially following the very divisive response that we saw last year with Halloween Ends, who just happens to be the creative team behind The Exorcist Believer. The Exorcist Believer takes place 50 years after the events of the original film, ignores everything in its canon, a la Halloween 2018, and we are presented this time around with a pair of new young teenage girls who happen to be possessed. Now, I am one of those of many who believe The Exorcist is 100% a masterpiece. It is a film that you don't need to have a sequel to. It never should have had a franchise or a television show, but nonetheless, here we are. And yet, even in the wake of that remark, I owed every piece of media that has ever been produced in live action on the screen, both big and small, for this franchise. I feel like there are so many things that this movie does right, and yet there are so many things that this movie had every opportunity to be different, and it just kind of comes across chaotic and messy. The blueprints of the Halloween 2018 Halloween Kills and Halloween Ends, the David Gordon Green Halloween trilogy, the fingerprints of those guys are all over this film. The way the shots are set up, the way that you have a lot of these moments in the first act, they're very choppy. They kind of feel like stylistic choices that very much are style over substance that don't really make a whole lot of sense. The lighting is everything feels the same. The way that the camera flows, it feels the same. And that's not necessarily a bad thing, but if you weren't fans of his take on the Halloween franchise, you are going to hate this movie. Coming into the first act of this movie, there is a lot that I feel like this movie is trying to establish. First off, let me just say that it's incredibly bold for the first film in a legacy trilogy. Why we need a legacy trilogy, I don't know. But I'm curious to see how the story goes in the other two parts of this movie. But we're talking about Believers, so let's stay on point. The first act of a movie should never feel this choppy, because the first act is set to give us and lay down the foundation for this, and I definitely feel like this just has a very poor foundation. So because it has a poor foundation, the rest of the film is just kind of set itself up for failure. This is a minor spoiler, but if you are coming into this movie expecting the Jamie Lee Curtis treatment for Ellen Burstyn on the subject of legacy, you are going to be much disappointed. This movie feels like it handles its legacy characters in the same vein that Netflix handled their 2022 Texas Chainsaw Massacre legacy character of Sally Hardison. I was very sad to see how they handled Ellen Burstyn in this movie. Like, she is the emotional core of the original Exorcist film, and one of the main reasons that I think it's partially as iconic as it is, among many other things, but the fact that she just is treated so piss poorly here, it just does not bode in its favor. Like, if you took Ellen Burstyn out of this movie, it would be the same exact film. There is literally nothing that she brings to this. There is like this like brief aside that you have Leslie Odom Jr.'s character, kind of an atheist agnostic, depending on how you look at it. And he gets a copy of her book explaining the aftermath of how she handled the events of the first film, and suddenly he's now open to the idea. I feel like that's really the only thing that she brings to this, and if you took out every scene that she has in this movie, this film would be exactly the same. And it might be better because it's actually shorter. They just did her dirty in this movie. Much like Burstyn was in the original Exorcist film, Leslie Odom Jr. is definitely the heart and soul of this film. And this film, had you not had a strong performance as Odom Jr. gives in this movie wouldn't have any really redeemable parts. Odom Jr. is absolutely the most exceptional accessory that this film has to offer. His performance really makes this movie even tolerable. Like, I don't know how to explain it. Like, this movie feels like a paint by numbers when it comes to the exorcism portions of its story. It definitely feels like it is trying to copy and paste a lot of the setup and the structure from the first Exorcist movie. But I think the addition and the relationship that Odom's character has with his on-screen daughter really makes this worth the watch and worth checking out. I think overall, the pacing of this movie is really neutral. It's not, there are never parts that really drag, but you definitely feel the weight of how long this movie is. And I feel like the third act is the bestest portion of this. So I mentioned this last year when we did our podcast on Halloween Ends, that there are things that David Gordon Green and his crew did within that movie and within that trilogy that I definitely respect them for. I didn't necessarily like it, but I respect that they decided to go a little bit differently than what we typically expect, and that's kind of how I feel about the third act here. I'd really be lying if I said that I respect the third act of this movie, but it's an absolute mess. The very first Exorcist film kind of set the bar for what to expect for exorcism movies moving forward. If you look at a lot of other Exorcist films, nearly almost every one of them pull inspiration from the original Exorcist. And what I think is interesting to note here is that our idea of a Western Exorcist film is that it is a film, subject gets possessed, and you call on the Catholic Church to come in and perform the exorcist. We saw it earlier this year with Russell Crowe's The Pope's Exorcist. And what I think is kind of messy about this, the third act of this film, is that it not only has that formula that's into play, but they're like, no, we're going to pull from all of these other world cultures that are going to be exorcists. And here's the thing. I respect the fact that David Gordon Green is trying to do something different when it comes to supernatural horror or possession or exorcism movies. And I like the fact that we're getting to explore other cultures having the spotlight when it comes to doing exorcism and the rites of exorcism on screen. Here's my problem, though. You need to pick one and roll with it, because otherwise you just get this very sloppy, very messy approach to storytelling. And when I tell you that there are multiple of these attempts at exorcism in the climax of this, it doesn't work. It's not an understatement. It's fact, and it's the reason that this film starts with a poor foundation and kind of crumbles by the end of it. I think one of the only redeeming factors to this just happens to be the emotional connection between father and daughter of Leslie Odom Jr. and his on-screen daughter. Like, I don't know really what else to say about this movie. It's definitely a movie that I'm going to A, have to watch again, and B, definitely going to have to sit on and meditate with. But let's run this through the Rorschach rating scale. For this moment in time, I'm going to go ahead and give The Exorcist Believer a 3 out of 5. I think this movie does just as much good as it does bad. I feel really neutral on this, and I hate being neutral on films, especially for a film franchise that I'm super passionate about. The Exorcist is one of my favorite books of all time. It's one of my favorite films of all time. And I really, really wanted more out of this, but it definitely looks like they kind of just copy and pasted some of the things, some of the lessons that they learned on the Halloween trilogy, brought that to The Exorcist. And so here's what I'm going to do. Make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button below, because on this video, I'm not going to be jumping into a final rating. The rating that I've given in this video is just a tentative. At some point later this month, I do plan on checking this movie out again, and I will update for a final rating, final thoughts on this film, because I feel like this is a movie that I need more than one viewing of to really make an accurate and fair decision, because again, I just feel really neutral on it. So make sure that you guys hit that subscribe button below. In the show notes, you guys will find links to not only our mental health resource library. So if you or someone you know is struggling, hit that down below. You guys will find links to all of our social media, including Facebook, Instagram, and more. You guys will find links to our podcasts, more movie reviews like this, how to support us financially, and much more. So until next time, thank you guys, and keep on believing.